ask everyone to hold your questions until the end of the evening, and then we'll take questions then. Thank you.
For the past semester,
use the microphone, please.
Sorry. We've been researching the 19th century and Irish immigrants and how they've been involved with parades. In the past 20 years or so, the New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade has been embroiled in religious and political controversy. Back in 1991, Mayor David Dinkins caused a stir by choosing to march alongside the Irish Lesbian and Gay Organization rather than at the front of the parade, where the Grand Marshal would traditionally march alongside the New York City Mayor. This upset the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the Irish Catholic group responsible for organizing the parade, because they had already banned the gay group from marching individually, but they managed to make it into the parade by joining an invited group. More recently, we've seen Mayor Bill de Blasio boycott the parade altogether over the exclusion of LGBT groups. And again, this past year, Guinness, a major funding source for the parade, pulled their support. While the struggle for LGBT rights is a fairly contemporary issue, the basic argument here is an old one. The organizers feel as though they have the right to parade and organize the event in whatever manner they choose and to march by whatever doctrine they choose. The gay groups feel as though their exclusion is an attempt to define what it means to be Irish. And more recently, they've argued that this is also an attempt to define what it means to be an Irish American, considering Dublin now allows gay groups in their parade. So this exclusion really has no bearing on modern Ireland. This injection of religious politics into celebrations has a long history in Irish American communities. Throughout the 19th century, New York City witnessed a number of violent clashes involving immigrants and parades. In outlining a few of these events, we're going to highlight the ways in which Irish parades have been used as a way to assert a particular group's strength, as well as an attempt to define who is an insider and who is an outsider. In particular, we're going to address three notable events in 1853, 1870, and 1871.
Okay. On the morning of July 4th, 1853, New Yorkers prepared to celebrate the 77th anniversary of American independence. The day would feature gun salutes, speeches, toasts, and of course, fireworks. But the day started out with a parade of the New York State Militia under the command of General Charles Sanford, followed by Veterans Corps, composed of those who served in battle against the British. You can see this is an illustration of an 1851 parade on Broadway passing by what was Providence Lyceum, which was a theater owned by an Irishman, by Broome Street. The parade started up at Union Square, up at the top. As you can see, they intended to go from Union Square up to 17th Street, down 3rd Avenue, over to Broadway, down to City Hall, where they would be reviewed. Nearby, a group of a couple hundred Irishmen prepared for their own display of civic pride. They gathered on 12th Street near 8th Avenue, holding aloft the banner of the Irish patriot Daniel O'Connell shaking hands with George Washington. This was organized by the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the same people that organized today's parade. Starting at their headquarters over on 8th Avenue, they were going to march across 12th Avenue, up to 14th Street, back down to 8th Avenue, and they intended to go down Hudson to Canal, over to Broadway, and fall in behind the military parade. Well, they never made it. At Abington Square, in today's West Village, a stagecoach driver drove into the ranks of the parade. Whether this was intentional or not, no one can say. The stagecoach driver said he was just trying to make his deliveries. The Irish marchers insisted that he yelled slurs at the marchers, anti-Catholic and anti-Irish slurs. Whatever happened, a general melee erupted. The Irish, attempting to get the stagecoach out of the way, they were attacked by nearby people. Soon firemen jumped into the fray, then the police got involved. 38 people were ultimately arrested, all Irish. The newspapers at the time, as was typical, blamed the Irish and attributed the violence to typical Irish rowdiness. The Irish would counter that they wanted to march peacefully, but they were unfairly attacked. So what did happen? To try to put these events into a little bit of context, I'm going to look back into Irish history. The Irish in Ireland had a strong tradition of parading going back over 100 years. Parades were used as an assertion of strength, cultural identity, and loyalty. Ireland was dominated at the time by an Irish Protestant minority who would parade through Catholic areas of Ireland on days of significance, especially July 12th, the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne, 1690 battle that ensured Protestant dominance in Ireland. The Catholics in Ireland adapted this parading tradition to their own needs, parading on days, of course, like St. Patrick's Day, but on other occasions to protest for their rights to assert their distinct identities. The fact that the Protestant Irish government tried to ban parading only encouraged them to do marching even more so. Violence, or at least the threat of violence, was common. This illustration is the Ard people are the Protestants, the Peep Day boys, attacking, supposedly in this illustration in Ireland, some Irish, so the sectarian violence in Ireland was common back then as it has been in recent times. Parading also had a strong tradition in America, albeit from very different origins. Born out of a popular protest that would lead to the Revolution, parades by the 1800s had become a popular and respectable way to show patriotism. There were parades for the 4th of July, for Washington's birthday, for Evacuation Day, parades to commemorate anniversaries of battles like the Battle of New Orleans or Bunker Hill. Some of these parades were martial in nature, but after the 1840s, they became more popularly accessible, with merchants and guilds also marching in parades. This is an illustration of the Grand Federal Procession that celebrated the ratification of the Constitution in July 1788 in New York. This became the basis of future Independence Day parades that would continue. The Irish who emigrated to America then in the 19th century found in parading a tradition that they could embrace as both American and as Irish, to assert not just their Irish Catholic identity, but their Americanness as well. The 1850s, however, saw rising ethnic tension between native-born Americans and the increasing number of immigrants, especially the Irish Catholics, who were despised for not being Anglo and for practicing a so-called foreign religion. Anti-Catholicism wasn't a new thing in this country, but when they were just a small sect, Catholics were more of a curiosity than a threat. As immigration increased, nativist feelings rose. You can see here on the left, this is an illustration, says, "Save the girls, batter down the convent doors of Catholicism, and the civilized world will be amazed." Americans have always been obsessed with sex, and this was, Protestants at the time were fascinated by what went on behind the closed doors of convents and monasteries, and assumed that these so-called celibate priests were taking advantage of these poor women. So these convent stories and these attacks on priests who insisted that the nuns were being held against their will was a common tactic. On the right, you see a typical illustration of the Irish. It says the usual Irish way of doing things, and there's an Irishman who looks more like an ape. He's drinking. He's sitting on gunpowder. This at the time was very commonly how Irish were depicted in political cartoons. They were not only not Americans, they weren't even human. In 1845, Manhattan's population was 371,000. 10 years later, fueled by the Great Famine by immigration, it was 630,000. You can see this slide illustrates all Irish immigration to the U.S., and of course you can see how it spikes after 1845 at the onset of the potato famine in Ireland. 1 in 4 New Yorkers was born in Ireland. Half of the population was foreign-born. Most of the Irish immigrants, perhaps as much as 80%, were Catholic. They were also largely unskilled laborers from agrarian parts of Ireland. 12% of all Irish immigrants in the United States lived in Manhattan. So this is a map of the wards in Manhattan at the time. The Irish were in all parts of Manhattan. They were especially prevalent in the 4 wards along the East River here. The 6th ward down here where 5 Points were. This up here in 15th ward is Greenwich Village, but the Irish weren't in Greenwich Village proper, but they were in the peripheries over here in the 9th ward a little bit, and along down here in the 8th ward. In Manhattan, Catholics were led by Archbishop John Hughes. He was known as Dagger John. He was an Irish immigrant himself, and he was a visible and formidable figure for both Catholics and Protestants in New York. He first came to prominence in the 1840s when he protested the use of the King James Bible in public schools. The ensuing controversy would lead to the creation of separate Catholic school systems in Manhattan. As anti-Catholic violence in Philadelphia erupted in 1844, it threatened to spread to New York, and Dagger John said that he would post armed guards around Catholic churches to protect Catholic property. His spirited defense of Catholic rights in New York helped to unite the immigrants from the Emerald Isle, ensuring their identity would not just be Irish, but Irish Catholic. However, this also contributed to the rising anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic movement known as nativism. The nativist movement was a struggle to define what it meant to be an American and who was included in that category. The nativists believed that Catholicism was incompatible with the Republican ideal. The nativists created a political party commonly known as the KnowNothings, whose platform included returning the King James Bible to public schools, restricting immigration, and increasing the waiting period for citizenship to 21 years. The Know Nothing flag is here at the bottom. It says, "Native Americans, beware of foreign influence." That's a riff on General Washington or President Washington's farewell address. And the nativists, Know Nothings weren't just a fringe group. They included some very prominent members of society. Henry Ward Beecher here, who was a famous abolitionist, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle John's Cabin. He preached over in Brooklyn at the time. He was a member of the Know Nothings. Walt Whitman, who, as you may know, was editor of the Brooklyn Eagle for a time in the 1840s. He was also a member of the Know Nothings. Not all so-called native-born Americans agreed with the Know Nothings, of course. Abraham Lincoln said in 1855, "As a nation, we began by declaring all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the Know Nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics." So on that balmy Independence Day in 1853, these competing forces came to a head at Abington Square. Whether or not the stagecoach driver disrupted the Irish parade intentionally, the Irish certainly interpreted it that way, that they thought that their right to parade was being infringed upon. They would later insist that the police became unnecessarily involved and that they were only striking the Irish marchers, the police were, and they weren't striking any of the other bystanders that were in the fray. The 38 Irish marchers who were arrested were arraigned in front of a judge who strongly rebuked the Irish for marring this patriotic day with violence. He wanted to send a strong message by setting bail at $500 a prisoner, which was pretty steep. The only person who spoke in defense of the Irish was the militia general, Charles Sanford, who remarked that the Irish had as much a right to march in their civic parade as we did in our martial one. Eventually, 13 of the marchers would be convicted, including the parade marshal, James Saunders, who was sentenced to 4 months in the penitentiary. Incidentally, Saunders, when the Civil War came, would raise a company of Irish, Company A, the famous Irish Brigade that fought throughout the Civil War. In fact, the Irish turned out in great numbers for the Union cause during the Civil War. Although the nativist sentiment would still linger, the gallant Irish service in the Civil War helped assuage much of the nativist feeling and convince mainstream American society that the Irish Catholics were indeed American. The Irish, by asserting their right to march on July 4th, the most American of holidays, were challenging the idea that being American meant Protestant Anglo-Saxon. Their rising numbers and their unity as a bloc got the attention of Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine, who around this time began actively courting the Irish, and soon the Irish became indelibly linked with Tammany. William Tweed in 1853 was an alderman, a state senator, and a ward boss for Tammany. His influence over the Irish helped propel him to prominence within the organization, and by the mid-1860s he was known as Boss Tweed. And this Thomas Nast cartoon from 1870 shows that the Irish were commonly depicted as slaves to Tammany who were unable to think on their own.
As the Irish Catholics became more politically powerful, Protestant elites sought to remind Catholics of their historic supremacy in Ireland. They did so by enlarging an annual parade on July 12th, commonly known as Orange Day. While major struggles in New York City took place in the 1870s, tensions date back to 1690 in Ireland. Here we've got an image by young Manhattan Gutenberg, 1690 painting of the Battle of Boyne, which Troy mentioned a little earlier. The Battle of the Boyne was fought on July 12, 1690, near Drogheda, Ireland. The battle was fought over English, Scottish, and Irish claims to the throne between the Roman Catholic James II as he attempted to regain the crown over his Protestant son-in-law, William III of Orange. James was ultimately unsuccessful in defeating William's larger and better trained army, and while the battle was technically fought over the right to rule, its legacy is typically boiled down to a conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. The Protestant victory at this battle really helped to secure Protestant ascendancy in Ireland and is often referenced in the context of Protestant superiority. This battle also really helped to found the Orange Order in 1795, whose flag is pictured on the screen behind us here. The order, named for William III of Orange, is a fraternal organization designed to protect a Protestant legacy. It's strongest in Northern Ireland, but it came over to the United States, New York specifically, as Irish Protestants emigrated in the 1820s, mostly from northern counties like Ulster in the north of Ireland. In efforts to assert their presence in the city, Orange Lodges continued a tradition of commemorating the Protestant victory at the Battle of the Boyne on July 12th with a parade and picnic. These parades were deliberately routed through Catholic neighborhoods to remind growing numbers of Irish Catholics of their historic victory and ensuing ascendance into power in Ireland. The Orange Order's official historians actually acknowledge this tactic when they write, "Parades were chosen to show strength in places they thought it might do the most good. Where you could walk, you were dominant." In understanding these parades as efforts to capitalize on past victories, we can better understand the deadly riots in 1870 and 71 at Orange Day parades. On July 12, 1870, about 2,500 Orangemen across the city gathered at Cooper Union. They began a procession up Broadway to Elm Park at 92nd and 10th, which no longer stands. Here's a map of their route, starting down at Cooper Union, ending up at 92nd and 10th. Along the route, which, as I mentioned, is pictured on the screen, the marchers allegedly taunted Catholic crowds and sang songs like Battle of the Boyne and Croppies Lie Down, all of which celebrate Catholic oppression and even highlight events where Irish Catholics were killed in Ireland. When the parade reached 59th Street, Irish laborers working on the Croton water main were made to believe that Orangemen had fired into St. Paul's Church, which is a Catholic establishment. Whether this happened or not, Catholics believed it to be true and followed the parade up to their picnic at Elm Park and attacked them while they were picnicking. Here we've got a headline detailing the events of that day. Very few policemen were present at the riot, and shockingly, only 8 people were killed, 6 Catholics and 2 Protestants. The riot was by and large viewed as a barbaric attack by Catholics on a peaceful march. While the public blamed Tammany Hall for allowing the Irish to go unchecked, it didn't directly threaten Tammany, but the lack of police intervention at the riot put a great deal of pressure on them to prevent a riot at the next year's parade. In 1871, knowing another riot could weaken Tammany in the eyes of the public, anti-Catholic groups added fuel to the fire. Here we've got a Thomas Nast cartoon depicting Catholic bishops as crocodiles attacking citizens on the shore, so you can see really how the media was attempting to position the Irish as dangerous. And this cartoon appeared in Harper's Weekly in 1871. Rumors began to circulate that Catholic organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians were preparing for a riot, and anti-Tammany newspapers like the New York Times perpetuated these rumors in efforts to turn the city against Tammany and its Irish voting bloc. Tammany also knew the riot would weaken them in the eyes of the public, so they did everything in their power to prevent one from taking place. Police Chief James Kelso and Mayor Aoki Hall banned the Orange Order from marching, stating that they would not aid an event involving feuds from another country. The Protestants still were determined to march, and there was a lot of speculation about whether there would be a riot on the 12th. An enormous outcry erupted over this ban. The public generally felt that if Catholics could parade on St. Patrick's Day, then Protestants could parade on their Orange Day on July 12th. They also felt the ban was giving into Catholic bad behavior at the previous year's parade, and they were concerned about the growing control that Catholics had over the government. Looking to distance himself from a failing Tammany, Governor John Hoffman allowed the parade to take place, but this time he had about 5,000 policemen and National Guardsmen called in to protect the parade. Here's their route. They were going to march from the 29th Street Avenue down to Cooper Union. On the morning of July 12, 1871, tensions were running very high, with all these rumors abound. Catholic crowds had gathered all over the city, and by noon they made their way to the Orange headquarters at 29th and 8th Avenue, where the parade was set to begin. Here we can see that crowd gathering. It's a great illustration of how many people were really turned out for this parade. As soon as the parade started, rowdy spectators were clubbed by police in order to clear a route to even get the parade started down 8th Avenue. And bricks and bottles were being thrown from buildings. And without order, the militia protecting the parade fired on the sources of these objects. Spectators heard the shots, and by 26th and 8th, the crowd and militia were in a frenzy, thinking that a riot had begun on the parade route further north. Fights were erupting as the parade moved south, and at 24th, military volleys were being fired directly into the crowd, again without a commanding officer's order. And here we have an image of that event. This left 60 Irish Catholics dead at 24th Street. In efforts to maintain control, the National Guard commander sent the insubordinate 84th Regiment, who was responsible for firing into the crowd, to the back and moved the 9th Regiment forward in efforts to maintain control. The militia managed to club and bayonet its way down to 23rd, where the crowds lifted and they turned east towards Fifth Avenue and moved into more Protestant territory, Protestant-friendly territory, I should say. And the parade met only minor resistance when they turned south at Fifth Avenue down towards 14th Street. The Orangemen disbanded at Cooper Union in the Village, the same safe place they had begun their parade the year before. Over 60 people were killed along the parade route, but no Orangemen were killed. This time, the riot really highlighted Tammany Hall's inability to control the Irish majority. This, coupled with New York Times' expose of corruption in Boss Tweed's administration, led to Boss Tweed's downfall and ultimate arrest in 1872. In choosing to march, knowing the Irish would cause at least some public engagement, the Orangemen really sought to highlight Tammany's weakness and sought to position the Irish as violent and unruly, and thereby un-American. While the Orangemen were successful in damaging the Irish Catholics' reputation, the Irish would see even more complete political control following Boss Tweed's demise.
The double blow of the Orange Day Parade massacre and the Tweed rig scandal did succeed in pushing Tweed from power, but his opponents did not succeed in permanently crushing Tammany, nor diminishing the Irish Catholics from their electoral influence. Quite the contrary. The man who would succeed Tweed was an Irish Catholic, and within 10 years, New York City would have its first Irish Catholic mayor. The Irish Catholics would hold power and influence in New York well into the 20th century. The Orange riots and the Tweed scandal was what we call today a PR disaster for Tammany. In the aftermath, the Irish Catholics took control of their political destiny. No longer content to be just mere onlookers within Tammany, they took control. They instituted reforms, partnered with city elites, and gradually became respectable, in the eyes of the Protestants. Which brings us back to the present. In 2015, the New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade will allow openly gay groups to march under their own banner for the first time. Over 2 decades of bitter acrimony over the right to march and the right to control who marches is coming to an end. For well over 150 years, the Irish in America have used parades to define both their distinct identity as Irish and American. The parades have also inevitably been tied up in politics as Irish traditions and mainstream American values collide. This latest change in defining who has the right to march is another example of Irish Catholic Americans adapting, demonstrating that they are indeed part of mainstream America. Thank you.
Got a bit of a height difference here, so hopefully, if you can't hear me, just let me know. I'll try and talk as loud as I can. No, it's okay. I'm gonna not use the stool. Keep my dignity.
Oh, we've got a stool at the ready just in case.
As long as everyone can hear me. So tonight we're going to talk to you a little bit about Washington's birthday, and just to open, my name is Samantha, and
My name is Horst.
and we are going to hopefully impart with you some of the knowledge that we learned about Washington's birthday, the celebrations that were held here in Greenwich Village, and the evolution of Americanization. So we really focused our research between the years of 1870 to 1920, looking at the influx of immigration, the turn of the century, and the decrease in celebration of Washington's birthday, as well as the beginning of World War I, and how that kind of changed the celebrations altogether. So we thought we'd start out with a couple opening quotes for you, just to give you a feel of Greenwich Village and what it was like at the two different time periods of the 1870s as opposed to the 1920s.
From Harper's New Monthly Magazine. The cleanliness, moral and physical of the village is accounted for by the fact that from the very beginning, it has been inhabited by a humanity of the better sort. From 14th Street down to Canal Street, west of the meridian of 6th Avenue, distinctively is the American quarter of New York. A sprinkling of French and Italians is found within these limits, together with the few Irish required for political purposes. And in the vicinity of Carmine Street and scattered about, there are some of the tents of the Children of Ham. But with these exceptions, the population is composed of substantial, well-to-do Americans. And it really does one's heart good on the 4th of July and the 22nd of February to see the way the owners of the roomy and comfortable houses which here abound proclaim their nationality by setting trim sheets of Greenwich gallantly ablaze with American flags, as compared with the corresponding region on the east side, where a score of families may be found packed into a single building, where even the bad smells have foreign names. This American quarter of New York is a liberal lesson in cleanliness, good citizenship, and self-respect.
And the quote that I chose is actually from Bruno's Weekly, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with Guido Bruno. He was an immigrant, not from Italy, as some of you might think, but from Prague. And he would write weekly magazines. It actually lived very close to where we are now, just south of Washington Square. And his quote is from the 1920s and really sums up immigration at that time. He begins by talking about the streets of New York and how they're extremely diverse in Greenwich Village, and goes on to say, "The most remarkable, most useful, and most beneficial things of the universe were brought here, put to the disposal of, annexed and assimilated by the American. And the American himself had come once from one of these countries. He had taken possession of all that he had found, and had given in exchange all that he had. He had come as I did." So this really sums up Greenwich Village and the immigration and assimilation at that time. And now we're going to kind of hop in our time machine and go back to the 1870s and tell you a little bit about the celebrations, parades, and the participants in the parades in the 1870s.
Certainly. It should be added that Harper's New Monthly Magazine, along with the more famous Harper's Weekly, all came out of a printing shop and a newsroom down on Pearl Street. Together, these publications formed what was probably the most successful publishing empire in terms of weekly and monthly news publications for the middle of the 19th century. Harper's was the magazine to check when you wanted updates on the American Civil War, and it's where Thomas Nast really made his name. A lot of the cartoons you saw in the previous presentation highlighted works from Thomas Nast, most particularly that image of an Irishman, really as sort of a half-ape, half-man. That's very much one of Nast's iconic images. He also, of course, famously gave us the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant. This magazine was viewed as respectable. It was viewed as eminently progressive. So when you're looking at things like super anti-Irish nativist rants, keep in mind that that's coming from a very free and forward-thinking sector of the American population at the time. To explain their attitude a little bit, I found just another snippet, and we're going to try to pepper this presentation with some of the original words, the people of the period really giving a great flavor for what this time period was like. In 1900, a Columbia history student wrote the following about the differences between Irish and English immigrants to New York City. "The English immigrant easily settled down among men of his own blood and tradition, was understood by them, was soon accepted as a fellow. The Irish immigrant, of another blood and another thought, stood somewhat apart in character, not so well understood nor so easily accepted by men of English blood and American birth. The point here being that for the 1870s and going into the early 20th century, the Irish represented not merely someone that was foreign-born, but someone who was really of a different race entirely from white America. What we're going to look at is a bit how celebrations of Washington's birthday ebbed and flowed around the turn of the century. In the 1870s, when Greenwich Village was the center of respectability and Americanism here in New York, Washington's birthday was as big a day as the 4th of July. Once those respectable elements begin to leave Greenwich Village, and this becomes a center of immigrant life here, and becomes really an artist's haven and a center of youth and vitality for the region, we find that Washington's birthday is really only a big deal in times of national stress and times when nationalism really hits it big. So we're going to just follow a bit of that. Washington's birthday begins actually as a public celebration while the general was still alive. We still didn't know what the office of the president was going to be while George Washington was still alive. Keep in mind that John Adams, the second president, suggested before one of our early constitutional congresses that we should address the President of the United States as His Excellency the President of the United States and protector of the rights of the same. He also suggested that it might be appropriate to address the President as Your Majesty. So we really don't know at this time what the President is going to look like as an office. So Washington, following the example and the standards set by British monarchs, celebrated his birthday as something of a public event. He'd have people over in large receptions. And while the holiday eventually evolved away from that, we no longer today, for example, would celebrate Barack Obama's birthday with a parade and patriotic poems. It wound up being something that stuck for much of the 19th century. The holiday remained unofficial until 1879, and then, of course, in 1971, with the Uniform Mondays Holiday Act, it was moved to just being the third Monday, rather than being the actual day of Washington's birthday. Things are actually set now such that President's Day never actually falls on Washington's birthday. It's always at least one day off. And we're going to follow a little bit of why those changes took place. Samantha's going to talk a little bit about parades and American Protestantism in the 1870s now.
So just one example of this American Protestant kind of Greenwich Village influence as opposed to immigration. In 1873, the parade was led by the American Protestant Association, and here you can see this is an example of a parade. This is actually from 1861, but it would give you a good representation of what the parade would look like. And this is kind of opposed to the growing immigration in the area, especially of Irish Catholics, who would have butted heads with the American Protestant Association at the time. And just to give you another little snippet, we have a quote here from the official website of the City of New York, who talks about in 1875 how a distinguishing characteristic of 19th century Greenwich Village was its reputation as the American ward, once again emphasizing that Harper's quote. In 1875, approximately 68% of residents were American-born, the highest percentage among all the wards. So as you can see, we have this wealthy Protestant community that's slowly being taken over by an immigrant population. And we actually saw a lot of celebrations, as mentioned in the previous presentation at Cooper Union, that were really focused on Americanism and often gave speeches about that. And of course, we'll tell you a little bit about that.
Absolutely. One should bear in mind that really nativist groups began to dominate by the 1870s the celebration of Washington's birthday, particularly in the neighborhood of Washington Square. Of course, having a square named for General Washington, this became the epicenter. This is where a lot of the parades would step off, going up Fifth Avenue, particularly once the statue of Washington is unveiled there in the 1870s. You've got a lot of people using these as the twin terminuses of activity for that. American Protestant Association, a nativist society, would often team up with the Orange Order that we talked about in the last presentation. They'd also team up with another nativist society known as the Order of United American Mechanics. Typically for Washington's birthday, they would gather. Dress codes for the period of the parade were generally a black silk top hat, black frock coat, black cravat, and maybe a rosette that would indicate which of these organizations one belonged to. Now you can imagine it would be something of a serious day. Very often there'd be police and National Guard presences at these parades. Most intriguingly, the National Guard wasn't just put out to guard the parade route, but they would join the American Protestant Association marching in the parade. The National Guardsmen were often issued with 40 rounds of ammunition a man during these years, the same compliment that they were given for going into battle or for quelling riots. So you can see they expect trouble on these days. Perhaps most intriguingly, every year the Order of United American Mechanics loved to drag out one of General Washington's last remaining carriages, which was described as a rather decrepit and rickety affair. And that would trundle down the street, and immediately behind it, on loan from P.T. Barnum, would be General Tom Thumb's carriage, which was a miniature golden walnut, designed, of course, to carry the diminutive general himself. So it was part sideshow and part patriotic reverence that they'd have stepping off from Washington Square here. To complement these parades, the Cooper Union celebrations would take place. These were lavish dinners given usually by a nativist society, particularly the mechanics loved to have their dinners at the Cooper Union. This is particularly interesting because, as many of you know, the Cooper Union was founded to be a free technical and scientific school which would accept students regardless of their race, their ethnicity, or their religious affiliation. So this great progressive organization winds up welcoming the American nativists into its doors to have their big brouhaha every year. We find incredible events taking place there. One event, occurring in 1879, invited a popular speaker, the Reverend Steele, to address the public on the topic of Americanism. He gets up, this is his big moment to define what America means, and he spends most of his hour's lecture railing against a new religious group, the Mormons. He's warning about Utah entering the state under the ill influence of these people. He's warning against the King James Bible being taken out of public schools. Then, surprisingly, someone calls from the back of the dais, "What about the Chinese?" You can imagine this is another great issue of the day. Surprisingly, Mr. Steele replies by pointing to the portrait of Washington behind him and saying, "That man was no treaty breaker," interrupted with large applause. He's referring to a treaty that had been signed with the Chinese earlier in the decade, in which we had guaranteed most favored nation status, an economic status where we would have open trade and immigration back and forth. By the late 1870s, we had discussed limiting Chinese passengers on ships to 15 passengers per ship to stem the tide of Chinese immigration. The Reverend Steele isn't concerned about the Chinese immigration, saying that in all of San Francisco there were at that time only 12,000 Chinese, and surely so small a number was no threat to Christendom. It should be remarked that the American Order of Mechanics is really more concerned with the influx of German and Irish Catholics and the idea that they're going to take East Coast American jobs away from the Protestant laborers there.
And on Washington's birthday in 1885, Cooper Union changed their tune a bit with the changing immigration in Greenwich Village. Reverend D. Henry Miller gave an address on Americanism, which seemed to be the topic on Washington's birthday. His speech focused on America as welcoming people with open arms, no matter where from, what religion, denomination, ethnicity, or economic status. And he even goes on to say that he would invite all the oppressed to come to our shore. The Irish could, if they pleased, have their harp and shamrock, but above them must float the stars and stripes. That was Americanism. So as you can see, they're now starting to be a little bit more welcoming to immigrants, but not quite wholeheartedly yet. And that kind of takes us into the turn of the century, where we saw a big drop-off in celebration of Washington's birthday. Most of the celebrations moved from local public gatherings to private gatherings that were held either uptown in private clubs, restaurants, down more south in Battery Park. There was also less mention of the holiday in the newspapers. Most of the mention was about how the weather turned out to be that day. And as you can see here, I hope you're all familiar with this photo of Washington's statue in Union Square. Every year on Washington's birthday, the veterans of 1812 would hang a wreath on Washington's arm. In 1889, the veterans of 1812 were mistakenly not invited to the celebrations. And although there were only 3 left, you can imagine they felt quite sensitive about the slight. And this kind of shows you the changing over from military parades and less focus really on the celebration. There was more importance of Washington's birthday put into public schools, as 280 public schools in New York City were enforced to teach about Washington and about Americanism. And as you can see here, this is a photo of some Protestant women teaching immigrant children about Washington and his birthday. I think Horst has a little more background on this photo as well.
This is just a generic magic lantern show that we're seeing here, and it was one of the really popular entertainments of the 19th century, and it became, by the 1890s, one of the signature local children's treats of Washington's birthday. This would usually be held down in a number of the newsboys' homes, down in theaters in the Bowery, and particularly they would use this as an occasion to show children the history of their country in what was to them sort of the equivalent of great living technicolor. And it's, you can see sort of a double light being cast. It was almost a 3-dimensional effect. They could make these slides move. One in the 1890s, actually it was an 1899 number, they started showing the children alongside Washington pictures of the Spanish-American War. And this is sort of the changing face of respectability on Washington's birthday. During our next war, we had this upsurge of patriotism, this upsurge of nationalism, and really all the accounts describe the children loudly cheering Colonel Roosevelt when his picture was shown, him charging up San Juan Hill in particular. This is, of course, mitigated, as we see again the tenor of the day, when the next slide was, I quote, Rastus, a little Negro who had been caught thieving, at which the children laughed hysterically. So we can see there's this blend of sort of inappropriate blackface minstrelsy comedy elements with the patriotism of the day. And this was the activity in which most of those respectable Greenwich Village ladies who would inhabit the homes on the north side of Washington Square, this was their activity for the day. We see the changing face of Washington Square here, a tramp accosting a well-appointed lady as she walks through in the 1890s. As the neighborhood became less well-to-do, a lot of those ladies fled to the private parties that Sam had mentioned, rather than going out for the big public displays that they had formerly. Places like Delmonico's and Franz's Tavern became the real centers of activity. The big news item for 1899 was a fistfight that broke out in Battery Park between a New York City Parks employee and a descendant of the Van Arsdale family over who had the right to raise the American flag come Washington's birthday. Get a show of hands. Anyone know what Evacuation Day is? Oh, good people. Oh, I love it. Good nerds. Evacuation Day celebrated the anniversary of the British fleet leaving New York City. Before they left, the British greased the flagpole in Battery Park to make it, they thought, impossible to remove the British standard from the flag. Captain Van Arsdale famously installed wooden cleats in the flagpole and climbed hand over hand to tear it down. His descendants claimed the right to exclusive flag raising in Battery Park until 1899, and that's when fisticuffs broke out because, of course, the New York City Parks Department thought that, like every other day in the year, they should be responsible for raising the flag. The fact that this gets greater coverage than anything happening here in Washington Square Park lets us know that the respectable inhabitants here had largely abandoned their public displays of Washington's birthday.
And we also see a bit of a drop-off, like I said before, of military parades in the area. And we see a changeover to volunteer firefighter parades. And you can see here there's a couple emblems from those parades. Most of them would start here in Union Square and go into Brooklyn. And while the volunteer firefighters were really honoring Washington and what it meant to be American, it seemed as though the people attending these parades were actually honoring the firefighters and these firefighters as American, and which is pretty contradictory considering that most of the volunteer firefighter squad was made up of immigrants, mostly Irish Catholic and Italians. And that was pretty common, these volunteer firefighter parades, in the early 1900s, and that kind of brings us into World War I and how that changed the dynamics significance of Washington's birthday?
World War I represented, by the time we got involved, an uptick of Washington's birthday. But before American involvement, it's a politically fraught time where Washington's legacy is being used to argue whether or not we should intervene in what was then viewed as an exclusively foreign crisis. Some people said Washington warned us against foreign entanglements. Others said that Washington represented a legacy of intervening when it was morally necessary. We see here the great news event of early 1917, women in uproar at a food meeting. This was women of the Lower East Side and Greenwich Village protesting high prices of food. In a letter to the President of the United States, the women write to President Wilson, "We call your attention to the fact that in the midst of plenty, we and our families face starvation. We pay for our needs out of the wages of our husbands, and the American standard of living cannot be maintained when potatoes are 7 cents a pound, bread 6, cabbage 20, onions 18, and so forth. We call to you, Mr. President, in this crisis we are facing, to recommend to Congress what authority they need for measures of relief." These women wanted $1 million appropriated to buy food for the families of New York City. You can see that this was the big news event of Washington's birthday for 1917, completely overshadows the small celebrations that may have been going on. Another great illustration of this, 1915, when we're a little bit further even from the war, when the greatest news event of the day is what fine weather we're having, and I quote, "Big crowd visits Coney. Holiday and balmy weather draw 50,000 persons to resort." So it was a Coney Island day for 1915, and not much to be had before it. Things changed considerably once we get involved in the war. And Washington's birthday of 1918 is used as a review of the troops. I'll quote here that 1/3 of the fighting personnel of the Metropolitan Division of the National Army, listed in the official records of the War Department as the 77th Division, will parade down Fifth Avenue this afternoon, 10,000 strong. It will probably be the last chance that New Yorkers have to cheer their own boys before they come home from the battlefields of France. Set in that upper portion is the review stand. The man standing at center is Secretary of the Navy Daniels. His assistant secretary was, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All the way to the right in the top hat is a rather young Alfred Smith, before he's really well known in statewide politics. He was at that point just known in city politics. But you can see with the density of that crowd, particularly noted that day as well was the participation of African American troops in the parade. They were in segregated units, but the newspaper accounts all suggest that the troops were cheered just as heartily, if not more so, than their Caucasian counterparts. So what we see here is a little bit of a revival of that great civic spirit that we saw a little bit earlier. Essentially what we see in conclusion here really surprised us. We thought Washington Square, Washington's birthday, this was going to be a home run. Naturally, there'd be celebrations the whole way through. What we find out is that really isn't true so much. Washington Square is the real nexus of large-scale civic parades only so long as the white Anglo-Protestant ascendancy wants it to be the ascendancy. And they only want it to be the center of their world so long as it is the neighborhood where they're actually living. Once they start moving further uptown, things like the Washington Blockhouse all the way in Northern Central Park become the center of the parade routes, the center of the celebrations. I think really the takeaway that we find here, looking from the 1870s through to the 1920s, is that while in the 1870s we have this very, very firm idea of who General Washington is, an unquestioned, almost godlike reverence for the man that founded the country, and coupled with that, a really uncertain and squeamish view of who these immigrants are. By the time we start looking later into the 20th century, Washington's birthday starts morphing into a leisure holiday, as we start to question the legacy of who Washington is, but become more confident of the fact that the United States will be a nation of immigrants. We start questioning the legacy of Washington. Washington's birthday becomes a Monday holiday, and by now you know it's really only good for sales on used car lots and department stores. We've lost sight of this holiday altogether, and it's now, some scholars refer to it as an abortive holiday, a day that we recognize as a holiday without actually knowing what we're celebrating. Our historical forebears in the 1870s knew darn well what they were celebrating and the man they were celebrating. They just didn't know what role immigrants were going to have in it. And Greenwich Village and Lower Manhattan played a key role in determining that while we don't always need to revere Washington as a god, we do eventually find out that there's room for everyone on Washington's birthday and year-round in the United States. Thank you.
New York's commemoration of Lincoln in the aftermath of the Civil War. The American Civil War left a powerful and lasting impact on New York City. Before the war, the citizens of New York were known to have favorable opinions of the South. Yet, thousands of New Yorkers flocked to Union Square to support the Great Union Meeting days after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in 1861. And this is a photograph of the meeting that day. As you can see, there was quite a turnout in support of the Union. For the next 4 years, New York City continued to live up to its reputation for being a political hotspot. Conflicting and often critical viewpoints of the war efforts and its leader, President Abraham Lincoln, persisted throughout the war. New York State held an important position as the most populous state in the Union. New York sent the most soldiers to battle and suffered the highest number of casualties. Greater than 53,000 New York citizens perished during the war. As many of you know, New Yorkers responded violently to the Union draft by rioting in places such as Union Square in July of 1863. One of the most well-known New York regiments, the 83rd New York Infantry Regiment, included multiple men from Greenwich Village. After Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, New York veterans came home to a war-weary city. In New York City and across the country, the years following the Civil War influenced the American holiday calendar. Holidays such as Thanksgiving and Memorial Day, and celebrations of individuals like Lincoln, helped unite the country and give Americans a common focus.
In his criticism of the Civil War, Fernando Wood, mayor of New York in the early 1860s, advocated for turning New York into a free city, divorced from political and economic ties with a state and country it often seemed so different from. Although today's New Yorkers would certainly have different reasons than Wood's for suggesting such a proposal, they might still be amused by Wood's idea. Though New York City was the nation's capital from 1785 to 1790, and later was Theodore Roosevelt's birthplace, many New Yorkers have forgotten their city's presidential connections, especially its connections to Abraham Lincoln. On February 27, 1860, Lincoln was photographed in Matthew Brady's Broadway studio, and later gave a famous address at Cooper Union. The speech, notable for its harsh criticism of slavery, was circulated in Horace Greeley's Tribune. Many historians, and Lincoln himself, credit this speech with helping Lincoln secure the presidential nomination. Though Lincoln was never to visit New York again, he became particularly important to New Yorkers, especially after his death. New York, in fact, played a crucial role in constructing the myth of Lincoln from the weeks after his death well into the 20th century.
Directly following Lincoln's assassination, New York City and the nation responded to his death. In his opening proclamation, Governor R.E. Fenton's proclamation said, the fearful tragedy at Washington has converted an occasion of rejoicing over national victory into one of national mourning, referring to the fact that Lincoln was assassinated on Good Friday and people would typically be celebrating Easter in the following days. Reporters also noted this shift from celebration to mourning in reports saying the usual exaltation appropriate for Easter Sunday was postponed to some extent, and everywhere services partook largely of a popular feeling of the hour. Churches such as St. Joseph's on 6th Avenue and St. Anne's, which was on 8th Street, both read or mentioned Archbishop of the Diocese of New York, McClaskey's remarks, including his note of the shift of celebration to mourning. On April 18th, guns were fired every half hour from sunrise to sunset on several locations, most of which were in Greenwich Village, such as in Union Square, the junction of 3rd and 4th Avenues, and Washington Square, by order of General Sanford. The mayor also reflects on Lincoln's assassination by declaring that public business be suspended several days following his death. There's the direct day of April 16th, the Sunday of Easter, as well as the day of the actual funeral, despite the funeral being in Washington on April 19th, as well as the day after the funeral, April 20th, as a day for reflection and prayer, as the governor requested. On April 20th, there was likely very little business as well, as Lincoln's body processed through the city of New York. The procession began at City Hall and went up through Greenwich Village, stopping at Union Square before continuing up Fifth Avenue to 34th Street to the Hudson River train depot to continue towards Albany. And that route is depicted in that map there, which is a map from 1860. Along Broadway, balloons were draped in mourning, as you can see in this image here, which is actually from the ceremony that took place at Union Square. This ceremony included exercises by multiple clergy from the city. It opened with a prayer by the Episcopal priest, Reverend Dr. Morgan Dix, and then continued with an address by the historian George Bancroft. Presbyterian Reverend Dr. J.P. Thompson read the last inaugural address of President Lincoln. Methodist Reverend W.H. Bull read a psalm, and then prayer was done by Reformed Reverend Dr. E.P. Rogers, Unitarian Reverend Dr. Samuel Osgood, and Rabbi Isaacs. The benediction was performed by Catholic Archbishop McClaskey. The procession also included members of the military, police, and fire departments, public officials, and community groups such as the Union League. A headline reporting the events of the ceremony stated that all nationalities, all religions, all trades, all classes, all politics, and all colors were represented in this procession, as well as in the spectatorship. And these spectators numbered 750,000. Following the ceremonies, the procession continued up to 34th Street, where it would reach the Hudson River Depot to take the body to Albany. And this image shows the number of people that were in Union Square for the ceremony, as well as the drapery that they included in their decorations. In the time that followed the ceremony, the people wanted a way to remember and honor President Lincoln in the years to come.
Since before the Civil War, Union Square has been a hub of political activity, playing host to parades, demonstrations, and speeches. During the later decades of the 19th century, two of the city's most powerful political organizations, the Union League Club and Tammany Hall, established their headquarters there. The Union League Club was established in 1863 in opposition to what its members saw as the corrupt and unpatriotic machine of Tammany Hall. Comprised of blue-blooded, very often wealthy men, including those accomplished in art and science, the Union League Club was intended to represent, in member Frederick Law Olmsted's words, the hereditary natural aristocracy. They were patrons of the arts and established the Metropolitan Museum. They were particularly outspoken advocates of patriotism and Republican politics. Although some of the most famous regiments of the Civil War would hail from New York City, in the early days of the war, many prominent New York politicians, such as Governor Horatio Seymour, were critical of Lincoln's handling of the war. In an 1861 speech, Mayor Fernando Wood went so far as to emphasize New York's economic ties to the South, in his call for the city, which before the consolidation of 1898 consisted solely of Manhattan, to become a free city independent from the political and economic interests of New York State and the Union. Though a Democrat, would eventually distance himself from Tammany, establishing his own rival faction known as Mozart Hall. Despite his reputation for enforcing cleaner government, Wood still relied on political favors from notorious downtown gangs, such as the gathering of votes from residents of the city's cemeteries. Although both organizations exerted influence over the area throughout this period, the Union League and Tammany Hall were only located near each other for 1 year, from 1867 to 1868. The Union League clubhouse was on 17th Street between 5th Avenue and Union Square, and Tammany was a few blocks away at 14th between Irving Place and 3rd Avenue. It was during that year that the Union League Club coordinated an effort to commission a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Union Square. The bronze statue was designed by Henry Kirk Brown, who was responsible for the 1854 equestrian statue of George Washington at the opposite corner of Union Square, which you saw in Horst and Samantha's presentation. The Lincoln statue was originally located at the southwest corner of the park on 14th Street. The statue, unveiled in 1871, depicts Lincoln as a neoclassical hero, wearing a contemporary suit but draped in a Roman toga, and clutching a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation written on a scroll. The installation of the statue was witnessed by some passerby and a few reporters, but was not marked with any special ceremony. Though Brown was hoping to portray Lincoln in a new and uniquely American mode, his creation was widely panned. A New York Times reporter wrote, "A frightful object has been placed in Union Square. It is said to be a statue of a man who deserves to be held in lasting remembrance of a true patriot. But it does not resemble Mr. Lincoln." The statue was originally located at a busy intersection on 14th Street, so a few years after its installation, a low stone barrier was built around it, incised with the words, "With malice towards none, with charity towards all." This is an excerpt from Lincoln's second inaugural address of 1865. The same speech in its entirety is inscribed on an inside wall of the Lincoln Memorial. The statue of Lincoln within the memorial was designed in Greenwich Village in Daniel Chester French's studio on 11th Street, albeit not until the 1910s. Despite the statue's initially underwhelming reception, it became a prominent meeting point on patriotic holidays. Throughout the 1870s, when Memorial Day was referred to as Decoration Day, the statue was often trimmed with streamers and flowers. In 1876, the Lincoln statue was the beginning of a day both of celebration and mourning, including a long procession down Broadway and the decoration of other memorials. This image of the 1875 celebration is a stereograph, a type of double image popular at the time for the three-dimensional effect it produced. The statue is presently located in the northern section of the park. 1 Union Square West, known as the Lincoln Building and adorned with small sculptures of the president's face, commemorates its original location. Though Union Square remained a locus of political activity, the Lincoln statue instead became a point of unity between New York's political factions. Perhaps like Lincoln himself, the statue was thought of as somewhat homely and awkward, but was gradually embraced by the people of New York.
Nora touched briefly on Decoration Day, and I'm going to go into more detail on how it evolved into Memorial Day. Along with the rest of the country, New Yorkers sought a way to frame the devastating losses incurred during the Civil War's 4 years of brutal fighting. How could anyone find meaning in the loss of 620,000 individuals? Northerners and Southerners differed in their approaches to commemorating their Civil War dead, but trends began to sprout up across the United States immediately following the Civil War. Memorial Day, as we celebrate it presently, evolved from an earlier holiday commonly called Decoration Day. In the late 1860s, people celebrated Decoration Day by bringing flowers and other tributes to dead soldiers. Soon after, parades and speeches became part of the celebration. Decoration Day offered Americans the opportunity to both remember and sometimes forget the Civil War's devastation, while also helping the country heal. New New York State is one of the many places that claims to be the birthplace of Memorial Day. In 1873, New York officially recognized Decoration Day. Years later, in 1889, the United States Congress declared the holiday as Memorial Day and chose May 30th for its annual observation. Memorial Day as a holiday blossomed like many other things in New York City during the 1890s. New Yorkers held all-day celebrations each year. The celebrations included a ceremony at the tomb of President and General Ulysses S. Grant, gatherings of veterans organizations, and a large parade. The 30th anniversary of the end of the Civil War occurred in 1895, and New Yorkers responded with one of the largest celebrations of Memorial Day. The city held a parade of more than 25,000 people, including 11,000 public school children who participated as the American Guard. The parade route started at 59th Street and continued down Fifth Avenue, where it ended at the Washington Arch. Washington Square served as the spot of the final review and also held one of two admission stands for the parade. E.J. Atkinson, the department commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, and Edward P. Doherty, the Grand Marshal of the day, oversaw the final review of the parade. This is a photo that depicts one of many of the military parades that passed by the Arch. It was taken between 1900 and 1912. Each year, leading up to the turn of the century, saw a more structured parade ending at the Washington Arch. The parade started to include more African-American regiments, as well as women's organizations, such as the Daughters of the Union Veterans. The parade in 1898 witnessed the growth of the meaning of Memorial Day. As Samantha and Horace mentioned earlier, 1898 marked the year of the Spanish-American War. So the parade started to show more patriotism. The year coincided with the Spanish-American War, and the 1898 parade saw an increased level of enthusiasm. A New York Times article from May 31st described the celebrations in Washington Square. It said, "After passing under the Washington Arch, the procession dissolved and several organizations went in different directions, some returning to their quarters and others proceeding to cemeteries or statues where they bestowed floral tributes. There was an enormous crowd congregated in Washington Square, and an unusually enthusiastic spirit prevailed there." Spectators and veterans also dispersed to Union Square to visit the General Marquis de Lafayette statue pictured here. And this photo is from 1900. Individuals decorated Lafayette with an array of evergreens, shields, flags, both French and American, muskets, and flowers. They also placed two Civil War-era flags at its base. The parade in 1898 and the years following reflected the growing interest in Memorial Day and its events. The Spanish-American War heightened the sense of patriotism felt in New York City, as New Yorkers once again waved goodbye to their troops as they went off to war.
As we hope we've shown, that despite political tensions in New York City came together to honor President Lincoln directly after his assassination, as well as following the Civil War. The city and the nation would look for ways to continue honoring both the president and the fallen soldiers of the war. As you can see, New York City held an important role in the establishment of Memorial Day, particularly in Greenwich Village and Union Square and